So now we're going to decide how big we're going to make our sewing machine mat. Our sewing machines are all going to be different sizes, and so I want to illustrate with the mat that I've already made. So we've got our nice big baby lock here. The first thing I want to make sure is I want to make sure that the whole sewing machine is going to sit on top of the mat. And the other thing I'm going to decide is, of course, how wide am I making this mat? How far do I want it to stick out on each side of my sewing machine? The other thing that I want to decide is, I'm going to call this how deep the mat is. Like I said, I want to make sure that the sewing machine is sitting on the mat, and then keeping in mind that this pocket is going to go over the edge, and I'm going to be sitting in front of it, so I don't want it to be so long that it's going to bump into my knees, and I want to have plenty of room so I can put all my little tools and gadgets and chocolate in my pockets. So you're going to look at your sewing machine and decide how big you're going to make it. So you're going to use your handy dandy little measuring tape. And so I have got I'm going to be at the back of my machine. I'm going to come down. 5-inch pocket is a really nice size, and so the depth of mine is going to be about 19 inches. And then I'm going to come over in the front of the sewing machine, and I'm going to mark. I would like this to be a couple of inches on either side of my sewing machine, and so then my mat is going to be 24 inches. So that is how we're going to decide how big we cut out our fabric. Now what I have here is I've cut out my fabric here's the one side. I could say the back or the front, but you're going to decide where you're going to put these pieces. So I have my one layer of fabric, I have my layer of my batting, and then I have my other layer of fabric. Okay, so now so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this big enough for the mat that I've decided and the pocket. So as you can see on the mat that we are making, you have this I'm going to call the mat piece, and then you're going to have a separate piece for the pocket. And I want to just show you quickly one more option when you're creating your quilt sandwich. What I have done on this one is I have my pretty floral on one side and I have my batting, but then what I've done is I have two separate pieces. Here I have the piece. This is going to be the size for my mat, plus a little extra, and then this is the strip for my pocket. So you can be really creative during this part and do several pieces of fabric. So after we have our sandwich together, we have the option of just doing free form quilting on the sewing machine, or if you would like, we can be a little bit more accurate and pre-mark the fabric. Now what I've done is I've just chosen the side of the fabric that's the easiest to see. Again, we talked a little bit about the marking pens at the beginning of class, and so I'm going to use the blue tip, which is going to be the water soluble. So after I do the quilting, then I'm probably just going to get a little damp sponge and go over this to take that marking away. And so I'm using a 1-inch guide with the ruler, and I'm just marking a line. Now one thing that I want to emphasize is these marking lines that I am putting on my fabric are just meant to be a guide. The sewing machine is going to feed nice and evenly. You can do a quilting line in the middle of this if you want to, and maybe you want to not have your quilting be perfectly even. So I'm just going to go totally out on a ledge here, and I'm going to mark a 2-inch, and maybe I'll mark a 1.5-inch line. So sometimes this more random quilting is really nice and pleasing to the eye too. So you get to decide how you want to mark that. So I'll finish marking that a little bit later. The next thing I want to talk to you about is I want to tell you about basting your quilt together. Now this could be done several different ways. When I first learned to quilt, basting a quilt together meant getting a needle and thread and doing a nice long sewing line and holding all the layers together. So that's basically what basting is going to do. It's going to hold all three layers of your quilt sandwich together so that it's not shifting around. There's the other option, which I'm going to use today, is safety pins. And so when you're using a safety pin, you can kind of scrunch it up and put it underneath here. That just ensures that it's going to go through all three layers. But you do want to keep smoothing it out as you go. And notice I've started at one end and I'm moving the other, moving in the other direction, just so that keeps all three layers nice and smooth. The other option for basting a quilt together is a temporary adhesive spray. And you just want to make sure that you're using one that says temporary, because there are adhesive sprays that are meant to hold this together for a really long time. And those are really sticky. So make sure it's a temporary adhesive spray. Those tend to be a little, I guess, smelly. And so I will do that out in the garage or someplace else where you have lots of nice airflow. So I actually prefer pin basting these together. And so after we have basted these, then we're going to come over to the sewing machine and start sewing. Now I have attached the walking foot to the sewing machine, and keeping in mind that your walking foot may look totally different than this. Now I'm going to turn this around so we can start to sew. And what I want to show you is that I'm going to start sewing from one side of the quilt sandwich and just move over. But I do want to point out that if I was doing this on a bigger project, of course the whole project is going to be marked and basted together. And then the other thing is, if this is a bigger project, I'll probably start quilting in the middle and move out from side to side. That's going to make sure a bigger project is going to be quilted more evenly. One this size, you're going to be completely safe starting to quilt on one side and then moving over. So I've got the walking foot attached. The other thing that I am doing is I am lengthening my stitch length a little bit. If you are sewing with, let's say it's a length of a 2.5 stitch length, then I'm gonna bring that up to maybe a 3.5. So now that I'm ready to quilt, I have taken out that first pin. One thing you wanna do is, as you're quilting, get the pin out of your way. You just need to be confident that your quilt sandwich is nice and together. And then you're just going to start to sew. So do you see how that walking foot or that dual feed foot is going to give you a nice even feed from both sides? Another thing that, if you have this feature on your sewing machine that's kind of nice, is if you stop with the needle in the down position. Sometimes that just gives you a nice secure feeling that this quilt is being held together. The other thing that you can do when you're quilting your quilt is, a lot of sewing machines have these great decorative stitches on them. This is a really fun place to try out some of those decorative stitches that maybe you haven't had a project to use those on. I'm going to get to that end. And then we're just going to come back up to the beginning. I like to do it this way rather than flipping the quilt and going from opposite directions. I like to just cut that thread and come back to the beginning. I think this has the least amount of shifting, especially if you use a walking foot. That marked line gives you a lot of confidence to go a little bit faster if you want to. Okay, now that we're done with that seam, one thing that you can do after every few stitches, go ahead and pull this out and look at the back. Just make sure that this is being quilted evenly and your fabric isn't bunched up. Now I'm going to finish quilting this and then we'll come back and do the cutting. Okay, so now I have finished the quilting. One thing I just want to remind you is that you can quilt right along the lines that you marked, or you can just use those as a guideline and do a little bit more free quilting. Okay, so next we are going to cut this out, and we're going to be cutting out two things. We're going to be cutting out our mat and the pocket section. Okay, so when I measured my sewing machine earlier, I want mine to be 20 inches across. First, I'm going to clean up this edge. I have a little selvage here, so I'm going to clean up that edge and get that out of the way. And then I'm going to use this left side and line that up with the edge of the... Basically what I'm doing here is I'm using the mat. You know, there are two different kind of, I guess, rules of thumb, whether you should be using a ruler for your guideline or the mat. But obviously on a piece this big, then we want to use the mat as our guideline. And what I'm talking about are the inch increments or the measurements that are on the mat. So I'm lining this up along the left edge. So this is going to be the width of my mat, and so the length of my mat was going to be 19 inches. So I'm going to line that up and cut 19 inches. And then I can just leave this as it is because my next cut is going to be 5 inches. 5 inches, I've kind of tried a few different depths. 5 inches for me is a nice size for the pocket. So I'm going to line this up and I'm going to cut 5 inches. All right, so now I've got that cut and I'm going to clean up the edge. Now, if we're really living life on the edge, and if you have a nice new blade in your rotary cutter, I'm going to lay the pocket right on top of the mat. I am just going to clean this edge up. So the way that I'm doing that to make sure it's nice and straight is I'm lining up a measurement of the ruler along the bottom edge of the mat. That just helps me know that this is not tilted and this edge is going to be nice and square. And this kind of applies to when you are squaring up the corners of your quilt also. You just want to make sure these are nice and square. Now I'm going to turn it around. So I'm right-handed, so it's easier for me to cut over on this right-hand side. So now I'm going to line up this left edge of these pieces we are cutting. And again, I'm going to use this mat as my measurement, and mine is going to be 20 inches wide. So I'm going to line up 20. And let's back up. One thing about cutting, especially when you're cutting a long edge like this, you really want to support this ruler. I don't know if this has happened to you where your ruler will kind of shift from side to side. And so I like to support that, then hold this in place and you just walk your way up the ruler. So that way, have you ever done this where you're cutting and then as you get up here, it kind of slides one way or the other? So walking your hand up that ruler as you cut with the rotary cutter is really going to kind of help hold everything in place. So now we have our mat and we have, let's turn it over. This is much prettier. But when you are doing your project out of the two colors, actually let me turn it this way, then you can decide. And maybe if this is the side that I want to have up, and then I'm going to use this opposite side for my pocket. This is what I did on the original sample because I wanted these embellishments of the piping and the prairie points to show up. So I chose this lighter fabric to be the pocket because all these other fun things are going to show on that. So now we are all ready and we're going to move on to the binding.